Hello, and welcome back to the Modeling Success in Action podcast. I'm your host, Jessica, and today I am being joined by the fantastic Ashley Rose. So, Ashley is an applied sexologist and couples counselor working out of a clinic called Empower Health in Vancouver, BC. She works with all genders in a trauma informed, anti oppression framework with a mix of bodywork, coaching, somatic work, and breathwork. Welcome, Ashley. It's so great to have you here.
Hey, thank you. This is fun.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. I mean, you and I are like, those little unicorns when you walk into the room and you go, "Hey, I'm a sexologist," or "Hey, I'm a hypnotist." People go, "What?" Like,
Yes, exactly. What is this magical land of which you are a part?
exactly.
Yes.
I
Well,
mean,
mine's getting more common. I don't know about hypnosis, but
yeah. Well, you know what? I think that probably both of them are getting more common because we are veering towards that more holistic view of wellness these days, right?
yeah, it's true. It's broadening out.
Yeah. Okay, Ashley. So tell us then, tell us a little bit about you and what you do because, the listeners here are probably quite curious.
Yes. Well, I got my counseling degree when I was in my 20s, and then I went on to run personal growth events. So I was always really interested in arcs of change, what makes people change, what doesn't make them change, and our consciousness as a humanity, and how that related to families, communities, and our global relatedness. And then I ended up doing 11 years in frontline social work with addictions and families. So trying to reduce the polarity between motherhood and the oppressions around motherhood and poverty, as well as how that um, cuts people off from access to their children and what support looks like instead of punitive measures. And while I was in that job, I wanted to segue back to private practice. And so the whole arc of this kind of support and inner work and exploring different paradigms of thought and growth led me back to zeroing in on sexology as part of my private practice. And recently, I was at a meeting where people were sharing about different work that they do. And the woman said, "Well, what led you to be in sexology?" And I said, "Overall disappointment." And she laughed because it's an honest answer. I looked at the relationships around me. I'd recently gone through a breakup. I was doing frontline work, working with outdoor workers, uh, frontline sex workers, and seeing, like, is this truly the state of how we know to be intimate, the commercialization of our bodies, um, how where people feel like they can discuss their sexual needs, the way we compartmentalize different aspects of ourselves. And so I I started down that path, and here we are.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you say we compartmentalize those parts of ourselves because I feel like that's exactly it. We're repressing or we're feeling shame or, embarrassment about our human bodies, like our natural instincts, the all of it, right? I noticed that over and over again. So how did you break apart those compartments? How did you integrate it all?
Mm. Well, I actually think something that's under discussed and identified is that when people enter a certain field, it's been maybe a territory of their gifts and their wounds. So I would say that I was really interested in sexuality and what it meant in our lives, partially because there was infidelity in my family home and it split it up. So there was like a motivation to really dig deeper, partially because I was a horny little girl and I wanted to know what is this body that can light up like a pinball machine, and partially because I saw the conflict in the adults around me. So there was like this wounded slash passionate drive behind everything I did to kind of understand it. Um, I think compartmentalization is natural as we come to trust each other at different depths. I think it's sometimes appropriate that we don't bring all of ourselves in every situation. And when it's driven by confusion, when it's driven around by a lack of acceptance or running from something rather than towards something that's part of our deeper nature, we get a bit stuck.
Yeah, absolutely. I see people stuck all the time, when they're coming into my office, they're, whatever's happening is presenting as like, an issue with the way they're interacting with life, but a lot of it comes down to really being in self-acceptance to be able to get past a lot of that. So I'm curious about how you moved through, being that teenager looking around at all the adults and going, what's going on here, to like where you are now. How did you start to become more embodied and embracing it?
Hmm. Well, I think the first access that we ever have to a sense of acceptance is modeling from our parents, which is where things get tricky because I think parents, by and large, have incredibly good intentions. And the pursuit of those intentions aren't always what works for us as people as we're growing up. And there's also things that they hadn't been taught or tolerances that they hadn't been given. And so, intolerance and tolerance, regulation and a lack of regulation can really be transmitted generation by generation. However, there's always talk about unicorns. There's always people in their family system that manage to learn how to self educate, that find a great mentor, that find a way to discuss things with uh, sometimes their parents or other people around them that allows for change, a dynamic sense of change rather than blame, for example, or stagnation in these topics. They begin to cultivate that road forward. Um, so I really feel that regardless of whether I had a blend. Like, my mother was very much about, like, oh yeah, have fun with yourself, and she was encouraging. She had two young girls, and she was trying to raise us empowered and to love and touch our own bodies. And then there was also this lack of trust of the masculine. Will the masculine actually hold you? um, and there was actually more permissiveness around sexual orientation, I would say, um, than trusting that other gender and what it could, the impact of you socially, the reproductive repercussions. And it just made everything so much heavier and less sexy. And I'm grateful for some of that, to be honest, because I think it kept me safer than other people have been, other women have been. And there were a lot of layers to peel in terms of figuring out what was true for me, what my sexuality actually meant to me, rather than my family or my community or the world that would have me express my feminine in various ways. Usually two or three options for women. Um, and I think it really was. It's a messy process. Let's just say that it's a messy process.
And you know what? That's actually a really beautiful thing to admit, because a lot of people are out there believing that there's like some sort of straight line that has to happen, or, if there is messiness, that it's not okay. But it really is just part of the humanness of it, that messy, that trial error, feedback loop.
Yeah, and I feel that what you're saying about mess right now is core to our ability to accept our sensuality and sexuality, because it's it's the bridge to the animal world and the natural world. And when we try to have perfection, we usually lose our sensuality, and we tend to lose the bridge to our uh, that primordial impulse that allows us to breathe and uh, express ourselves through our voice, that allows us to move according to our rhythm and have the shape that we have as our unique selves. And it breeds this culture of kind of cookie cutter responses in sexuality, and also just in the way we move through a room. Um, so I think in that sense, it enhances the compartmentalization when we can't accept our own mess.
Absolutely. Well, because we're putting it on a shelf, kind of going, that's a shameful piece. I'm not even going to look at that right now, right? I'm just going to be in my mind rather than in my body. I see a lot of that, people in their minds instead of their body. So you and I had a conversation recently, and I offered you something, and you said, I need to feel into that before you're ready to like do what you needed to do. A lot of people say, I need to go think about it, but you said, I need to feel into that, which I thought was really quite telling about how very kinesthetic you are. So I'm curious, were you ever somebody who was being really cerebral, really in your head? Did you have to move into the body?
Absolutely. It was one of my first escapes was to kind of analyze what was going on in my family life and analyze the culture at large. And I thought that I could add more value there than in my being, because my being had already been there through all those crunchy things, and it wasn't enough in the sum total of what I was hoping would happen or wouldn't happen inside my family or the world. It didn't make as much of a difference. It gave me other gifts. And I see a lot of that both in sexuality and with talented practitioners in many sectors, but in sexuality as well, as their coping behavior gave them gifts to facilitate. However, these are not relational gifts. These aren't gifts that allow us to deepen our intimacy with ourselves, our intimacy with our partners. Our partners will be the first person to blow that out of the water and make our strategies not functional, and our families probably.
Yeah, yeah. So for you, what was it like? What was the experience of, pattern interrupting yourself when you're in the head and moving into the body over and over?
Well, I'm fortunate in that I love to dance and I love music. And I think if there's a gateway like that, it's really wonderful to use. However, I would say that my whole dating approach was very the postures that I would take when I was getting to know someone were based in a role, not in a being. So I would posture with people. And part of coming into my body was finding the people that I also felt safe around, which is also a somatic process. There were people I was less cerebral around. Now, my noticing of that took a while to evolve. So that's where it was really advantageous that I was in different types of programming, exposed to so many different ways of being and life. Um, and also noticing, valuing, centering any of my body-based processes was took a long time because I had cognitive patterns that said, "Uh, this probably isn't possible for me," or "This person may not be safe for me." So it was really clicking into a role with someone and finding it safe enough and finding them charming and finding the love in that partnership that started for me to build enough relationship and safety and experience, I would say, to have me honor my body and have me accept myself.
And I'm curious also about outside of the relational aspect of it, when you were just alone and you were, feeling into your body or moving from the head into the body, what was that experience like? Was that easier for you or was it the same?
I think it was really about cultivating presence because sometimes we talk about presence like we're present or we're not, but we're always present to something. So it was a redirecting that channel and making it the priority. Now, when I really deeply started doing it, I my sexuality changed. I started squirting. I became a squirter. That was never accessible to me because I wasn't familiar with the holding patterns in my body. Wasn't open and surrendered enough. Um, but it really became a playground again, like it was for me when I was a little girl. So at least I had that. Um, I remember writing poems about how beautiful I was as a child. And my mom and my sister would just laugh at me. And I'd be like, it came from a really humble place, ironically. That there was this very engaged self-esteem. And then there was like this 25-year gap. And then on this body-based path, it was just I always loved being alone. That wasn't it. That was never an issue for me. But the depth of my communion with self was in a totally different ballgame.
That's so beautiful. And it's so interesting that you could harken back to when you were a kid because it's true. When we are kids, we do have this unself consciousness, right? Little kids are, they will do and say all kinds of things. I mean, they even had a show about it, right? They are so free and liberated for, that those years below 7, really, when they're just exploring the world. And then we all of a sudden become self-conscious, especially when we become teenagers, which is so interesting.
Yeah, and then to your point, we start seeing ourselves from the outside rather
Yeah.
than the inside,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
We're
And
objective to ourselves.
exactly. And imagining how other people are looking at us. And then at that point, often we really don't have the insight to appreciate that there's nothing we can do about those people judging us or how they perceive us. And we are often trying so hard to, bend ourselves into all kinds of pretzels to make it the way we want it to be. And it can be so stressful. And that can be, something that makes us really want to compartmentalize all those things.
Absolutely. So I would say that's the number one thing I see in my practice is that people think that they're on a sexual path with someone, but they're actually navigating threat. That's the first thing that's happening. So they think they're making love, but the ratio of what they're doing in order to gain affirmation, to feel a sense of belonging, to feel okay in the eyes of the other, in order to have a fighting chance of being in their body. Most of that is taking up a lot of the lovemaking space, more so than the actual. So then it brings up the question, what is sex? How do we know we're doing it? How do we know when we're making love? So when people come into my practice, part of what we're working on is that somatic mapping tracking and helping people be more loyal to their inner experience. And how do they get some of those trust and attachment and confusions out of the way, whether they're wanting something in bed and they don't know how to ask for it, or they don't know if they trust their partner. Maybe they're not drawing the quality of partner that they're really wanting, or maybe they just haven't communicated any of this to their actual partner. It really changes the lovemaking space. So that's often when we're talking about sexuality, you spend a lot of time on topics that have no direct link to sexuality. They feed into it,
Yeah,
but
well,
you don't always end up talking about sex.
there's so many layers to it. And so
Mhm.
when you're working with your clients to be able to kind of shift the experience with their sexuality from that kind of closed and shameful, right? If they're not saying it to their partner, and your partner should be, theoretically this person that you trust the most in the world, right? That's there to support you. And if you're not able to really communicate what needs to happen to that person, how do you help them, move through that?
There's a lot of things that pull us out of trusting our own selves and trusting outside of us. And that seems to be a theme that we continue to come back to over and over again. It can be, we don't always know all the little moments that have accumulated inside our somatic experience that led to our kind of, I'll say, objectification, for lack of a better term. Um, Whether it's how our parents reacted when you know, we were potty training, to how a group of people might have loved in a group of other our peers at a given age, prepubescent, adolescent, reacted to us. And teenagers are complicated. So even if we got negative feedback, we don't know if they were admiring us because we stood out. We don't know. We're missing a boatload of information, but these things get internalized. So part of what we're doing is externalizing, putting all those goodies on the table, and then reselecting the ones that we're actually wanting to inhabit and we're wanting to move forward with. I work with a lot of people of various genders who come in and they say, I'm not attracting the the person that I want. And so there's a lot that goes into what we signal and who starts looking at us across the crowded room. And we don't have the awareness all the time as we're moving through life to know what's actually showing up in our energy field and what we're actually communicating. But when we start to become more connected to ourselves, our signaling changes, and relationships become a whole other ballgame. There's people who've done a series with me, and then they say, I can't believe I dated that person that I just broke up with. it's unimaginable to me right now because I'm thinking in a different way. I'm feeling my body differently. They're not attractive to me anymore. And this is the scale of shifts that's possible when we're working with our bodies and our sexual, our life force, essentially, actually.
Mhm. So that's really an interesting thing too, because as I mean, you're working with couples sometimes as well. So if they're, shifting their own relationship to their body, their own relationship to their sexuality, each of them, and then the partnership, what if all of a sudden this long-term partner that you've had for, whatever, all of a sudden you are going, I don't know if I'm attracted to this person in the way that I should be or want to be. What then?
Yes,
Yeah.
that is why it's so beautiful to have that third person. First of all, partners can panic each other with change. Maybe one person is in a really growth oriented phase, the other person isn't, or one person's having a really successful year and the other person isn't. Or there's been so much unsaid throughout the bulk of their partnership that there's a lot to air, or there's been a lot of harm and you have to clear the dust under the carpet. For all these reasons, it's nice to have a co regulating force who can also direct those conversations towards productivity. Because what can happen is that um, partners can be scared about what it means for their entire life. They're taking this huge chunk of like, oh, do I have to move now? Are we going to break up? What about the kids? I thought that this person was the one. And with a little extra grounding and a little more tolerance for the tension of those conversations, and someone who knows how to kind of cross pollinate two sexual systems for um, there's ways that people can be very, very different and still compatible, but not everyone knows how to work with our bodies because it's been a taboo topic for a long time. So having that third person is just really advantageous. And finding someone, spending some time with whoever you choose in advance so that you really know if they're going to be working for you is important. Um,
When you say spending some time with the person you choose in advance, you mean the third party support rather than the partner, right?
yeah, sorry. If I think it's important to vet practitioners. And I think I always offer discovery calls because I think energy is a really powerful thing. These are deeply influential territories that affect money, career, kids, divorces. I personally, when I'm working with couples, the end goal is not to stay together. My end goal is to clarify what is going on in the dynamic of the partnership so that they're supported in their highest. And so that's part of the front loading that we do there.
So sometimes it does end up that they are, parting ways, I would imagine, or that they have new ways of interacting with the sexual part of their relationship. Very interesting. So I'm
Yes, it can
curious.
change. It can change. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah. You I'll get my curiosities out in a moment. You're on a tangent. Please go.
Yes, there's definitely ways that relationships can change form. But I find that when it's driven by authenticity, not, again, coping strategies, whether that's infidelity or that's communication patterns where people feel a level of oppression or a lack of power, personal power in those things, there's much greater capacity and probability of people staying in harmony, of maintaining friendships, or sometimes it takes people far deeper than they would have gone. Sometimes two people do come in thinking that they're just dating and there's some conflict happening, and they realize that they would love to experience the marriage track together. Um, Everything redistributes in our system and in our lives and in our relationships when we're truly willing to do that inner work.
Mhm.
And that's probably why most people don't do it until they're in crisis.
Well, yeah. And I mean, it can be messy, right? And like you said, we are all really trying to avoid that mess a lot of the time. That's what's happening with so many people. And we don't even realize it. This is just, it feels like the way it is sometimes, right? That this is just how life is. Of course, sex is shameful. Of course, I should, feel embarrassed of this or that or the other thing. So, how do you, move through the experience of you are so embodied, you are in touch with your sexuality, you are, out in the world and living life in that way. I'm sure there must be, experiences that you've had where other people were judging that or were, feeling maybe they were feeling threatened by that. How do you move through that? Because everybody who wants to become embodied is going to come across things like that. So what's that been like for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I actually experience a really high level of judgment when people ask me, "Is your job hard?" They sometimes think it's the complexity of the clientele or the work that we do, but it's actually everything around my business. The perception that people have about what we're doing, um, the projections that different people might have from various eras of my life, whether it's the old high school people, people I've schooled with. There's a lot of mistrust around this topic, and I also think it's an important part of being a practitioner in this particular field because if there's been a lot of hurt, there's been a lot of confusion, and there hasn't been enough conversations around all of these things. So I think it's just part of holding the field of energy around the topic that's really important. How do I hold it? Um, I think in not polarizing or making wrong, which is the key to a healthy sexuality anyway, and a healthy culture, I believe, is in legitimizing other people's perspectives and finding the way that you relate to like the part of you or the topic that you have where you are similar in that sense, and knowing that you are not neither better or less than anyone. I think all of those things naturally create harmony. But in terms of skills, sometimes I have too much energy on a certain charge in a certain topic. So I do breath work and I have a whole bunch of rituals that I do for myself, mostly to support my body and my spirit that allow me to then do the inner work to say, you know what, this is okay, or this is where I want to set a boundary, or this is where I want to clarify myself.
And so those that's okay. Those practices that you come to, you mentioned breath work. I'm sure most of those practices to get you out of it are likely somatic in nature. Yes?
Yeah, they have a lot to do with nature, which I think is a huge guide for the body and body-based processes. But then it gets intellectual after that. I think the body is for the extra charge. I think the analysis is actually important because part of healthy psychology is being able to compartmentalize the body and not believe the reaction that it first has. You know, sometimes I'm really hurt initially, and that gives me a lot of extra charge in my body. So I help my body, and then I go back and I do a bit of cleanup on an intellectual level and say, wait a minute, what am I committed to? I reorganize my trajectory, my and I pivot, and then I come back to how I want to feel
I
in the
love
world and what I want to stand for. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I love that you mentioned that you can't always trust the signals that we're getting from the body because you're right. Like there are some reactions that are like unuseful for the really big picture outcome, right? And so being able to acknowledge those, manage them, choose a mood that's more resourceful, get into, shake, literally shake it off, right? When you see dogs in a fight after they're done, they shake it off, right? And then they
Yeah.
move on with what they want to be doing. And so we're animals. We're animals. So
Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so cool. All right. So, Ashley, is there anything that you'd like to leave the listeners with? Perhaps something that they could do to start to become more, in touch with the body?
Yeah. I think we need to notice ourselves more. I think we're in, at least in Canada, I don't know how large your listenership is, but in Canada, there's a lot of go, go, go. There's a lot of personal ambition. And ambition is very future oriented, and the body is very much in the present moment. So, finding times to check in on our breath, making sure that it might sound funny, but there's a lot of people, high powered CEOs and people like that that don't check in on their body. Like they don't go to the bathroom. they will power through and they will hold it. And so part of that is like respecting your own rhythms, respecting when you're menstruating. What are my body's needs right now? What are my needs for nourishment? I think the more we value the body, the more we can value each other and the more grounded we can be in relationships. But I think it's quite profound, the ripple effects of our ability to sustain a quality of honoring of who we are. I think it's a really important time in what's happening in the world at large. I think it involves racism. Like when we can't accept our own body, then we project on others. I think it involves how we view men and how we view women. And I think the key is really coming back to ourselves and, what they call the body temple in some circles, and really treating it as sacred.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, the body is the it is the fuel. It's the thing that allows us to be ambitious. It's the thing that allows us to get all of what we need. And if we are not respecting it, we're not going to be able to function in life the way that we really truly want to. Yeah, it's interesting that you say, there are people who are not going to the bathroom, and it's true. I see it all the time. People are so stressed out, or they're putting so much pressure on themselves, or they believe that, the story from the mind is the only way, and to the detriment of the body. And I mean that is often how people end up, stressed out or not being able to sleep or even overweight because they're not paying attention to the body's real needs. So that's
Absolutely. Yeah, and we see a lot of people with like crazy cortisol levels because of this too. And when your hormones are off, your sex hormones are off. And so people go to have intimacy with their partner and they're like they've got a brain they've got the chemistry of someone who's being chased by a Bengal tiger rather than rather than someone who wants to be intimate. So for all these reasons, it's vital.
it totally is. Well, thank you for joining me, Ashley. I think I'm going to leave it here for today. If anybody wants to get in touch with Ashley, I'll put all of the details for her below in the description here so you can reach out. But thank you again for coming on and sharing your model of the world, your insight. I hope that we can all kind of literally step into it and try on what it's like to be more embodied. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica.